Welcome everyone to another episode of NGW's In a Nutshell podcast, where we delve into the latest developments impacting the global gas market. Once more, I am joined by Anne-Sophie Corbeau, a global research scholar at the Center on Global Energy Policy at Columbia University's School of International and Public Affairs, and Thierry Bros, professor at Sciences Po Paris. Hi to you both.
Hi.
Hello, good afternoon.
Okay, well, let's look at, as we usually do, let's start with the European markets. Thierry, what's been going on with Russian gas recently, so far this year?
Well, interesting enough, you have two elements at the European market. As usual, you have the policy people stating that they want to get rid of Russian gas. And on the other side, you have the flows. And we report the flows every month. And what we've seen is in the first quarter of 2024, Gazprom pipe flows were 30% above last year. And this means that it's not Gazprom pushing more gas. It means it's some European utilities that are calling for this more gas. And it's interesting to think about this at a time where we are long in gas. We have storage that are very full for the period, 60% full. So this means that on one side you have the dogmatic policymakers, and on the other side you have the industry. I wouldn't say pragmatic on this case. You have the industry that wants to increase their profit by calling it cheap Russian pipe gas.
Mm-hmm. And Sophie, what else is important to note happening in the market
I think,
right now?
Thierry has said already the most important thing, which is that Russian gas is still flowing, which is also something that we noted in our latest report with Tatiana on Russian gas in general, Russian gas exports outlook as well. There are going to be two important things when it comes to Europe and Russian gas. So at the end of the year, as we all know, the transit agreement between Russia and Ukraine is going to end. There is no way this transit agreement is going to be renegotiated or extended as such. There won't be any multi-year agreement with a determined number of BCM transiting through Ukraine. This won't happen. The key question is whether or not some European companies will be able to get access to Russian gas at the Ukrainian and Russian border and also book capacity through Ukraine on a monthly or yearly basis. And what we hear on that is different statements from different politicians, whether in Europe or in Ukraine. Some people, notably in Ukraine, say absolutely no way, because we are at war with Russia and we don't want this deal to continue. Fair enough. Other people, notably in Austria and in Slovakia, are saying, well, we are not completely prepared, so we need the gas to continue to come. And at some point, we need to have a decision, and if possible, to make a decision before the 31st of December 2024. So there are about 9 months to go. I think it's a good idea to decide, okay, yes or no, we will or won't have any more gas transited for Ukraine. And we go from there. And then if no, then especially Austria and Slovakia need to find a way to get access to alternative sources of supply, which is not straightforward, but doable, considering especially where we are in terms of storage. The second thing is about LNG. I don't think that we are going to see a stop of Russian LNG coming to Europe this year. However, in the hydrogen and decarbonized gas package, there was, a sentence saying that individual countries could potentially ban Russian LNG. I think, especially given that there are 3 countries which are importing Russian LNG, there is a possibility of an agreement to ban Russian LNG, but not today, when there is enough LNG on the global gas market, and this LNG presumably is going to go somewhere else. So that's the 2 things to look for. Russian LNG and the transit deal between Russia and Ukraine at the end of the year.
And you mentioned Central European countries, whether they can find alternatives to Russian gas after the Ukraine transit deal expires. What are those alternatives?
Well, I mean, you will have to go through, the surrounding countries. So, for example, I mean, maybe, going through Germany, which, as everybody knows, is also considering increasing the pipeline tariffs, also Italy. So there are possibilities also through Poland, although it's fair to say that, as you say, LNG import terminal is currently used pretty much as capacity. There is a little bit, or there was a little bit of spare capacity in the Norwegian pipeline. So there are ways, but I think, the politicians and then after the companies and the TSOs need to sit down and say, okay, so if there is no more gas coming from Ukraine, and especially considering that we may actually need to export some gas to Ukraine because, Ukraine may need additional gas in the future. We don't know exactly what their balance is going to be compared to their gas production. Well, you need to prepare that. And, as I said, we have now less than 9 months. It's a good time to prepare. We are in a good situation, but we need preparedness.
On this one, I fully agree with, and so I think at the end of the day, it will be done perhaps not on the 31st of December, but at the end of December. Remember last time it was around the 19th of December. So negotiation will start during this summer, but I believe that unless there is major changes, the Hungarian, the Austrian, and the Slovakian will be able to sign some transport deal via Ukraine, because at the end of the day, maybe Ukraine doesn't want it, but I mean, we are doing a few things for Ukraine. So I think Ukraine cannot, unless the pipes are not in operation, cannot just say no on this because it's a regulated system, etc., etc. So I believe that plan A is going to be we continue to receive some Russian gas going forward, more or less the same kind of volumes. On the LNG, yes, remember, it will be completely insane from a country receiving LNG, name it France, to decide to ban a Russian LNG, because this Russian LNG will move to another country, will move to Spain, or will move to Zeebrugge, and will create some issues in terms of fees in the regas terminal, etc., contracting fees. And so the only way forward is going to be a ban, an embargo, and an embargo needs unanimity, and I don't think this is happening anytime soon either, like Anne-Sophie. So those are, for me, the element. We are going to see continued volume of Russian pipe gas going forward and Russian LNG going forward. The only element that we've seen not coming is Arctic 2, because the US have implemented extremely tough sanction on Arctic 2, and this is why, at the end of the day, it had to not start its export, not start exporting Arctic 2 as we speak.
Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned Arctic. Sorry, go ahead, Anne-Sophie.
Sorry, yes, no, I am not in full agreement with Thierry. I think there is an opportunity for European policymakers to stop Russian LNG imports to Europe, but they need to really understand all the implications and prepare for that. I think there is a window starting from 2026 onward, because there will be more than enough gas on the global market. However, but what they absolutely need to understand is the legal implication based on the contract. So they need to sit down with the companies which are importing that gas from Russia. They need to sit down with lawyers. They also need to sit down with the LNG operators, because there is a little bit of transshipment which is happening. So they need to understand everything so that they can have a measure which hopefully will not require unanimity. I'm really talking about, the countries which are importing LNG. So therefore, not requiring, the implication of Hungary, so that you have a system which allows you to ban Russian LNG. And therefore, well, this LNG is going to go somewhere else. But you need to prepare that, and you need to talk to the interested parties as soon as possible.
On this, I think Hungary, by the way, will be in favor of banning Russian LNG, because they don't get it. So I don't think. No, I agree, Anne-Sophie. It's not going to be done 2024, 2025, and remember, there is an election and the European Parliament, and we may find a different parliament going forward.
Yeah, I think it's interesting to note that, as you mentioned, Thierry, very, very tough US sanctions on Arctic LNG-2, but even the US has stopped short of any sanctions on, I mean, for example, they haven't specifically sanctioned Novatech, which would give, Yamao LNG the same problems that Arctic LNG-2 is facing.
I think it
We
goes
can't do
back to
that.
one. Anne-Sophie, yeah, exactly. I think it goes back to what Anne-Sophie was saying. I mean, we need this LNG as we speak,
Yeah.
and so sanctioning a new project is possible. And again, remember, prices haven't gone so much down in Europe because people are understanding we might not swim in LNG as people were thinking going forward. But sanctioning Yamal LNG would have been much more difficult for the US because this will have impacted the Europeans. They will have had further issues in terms of security of supply, further high prices, further deindustrialization, and I don't think this the European will have allowed.
If you are looking at Russian LNG today, this is more than 40 billion cubic meters. So this is a very significant part compared to the 550 BCM of total LNG. So you can't just remove that from the market, not now. I think everybody who is importing LNG right now will be screaming. So the Americans understand that. However, that doesn't mean that, 2027, they would not also take sanctions at individual projects. So maybe Novatech Yamal LNG, for example, to start with. Sakhalin is a totally different matter. I think the Japanese would be very annoyed, concerned about, sanctions on Sakhalin LNG, which for them, well, not only are they still importing LNG from Sakhalin, but this is also a very important LNG plant because this is the closest to them. So from a security of supply point of view, especially if there is, a crisis with China, this is a very, very important LNG plant. So you have to take all these things into account.
I mean, it's very hard to say when Arctic LNG-2 will be online now. But it seems like the killer blow, the main problem that the sanctions caused was the availability of icebreaking carriers. And that's, it's very hard to see how that can be fixed. I can't remember. I think it was more than 20 ice class LNG carriers that Novatech originally planned to get for the project across its three trains, and it's only a handful that may or may not come in the next year, and where the others will come, don't know.
Going to be very difficult. I mean, I think some parties are looking at the Americans thinking, okay, can we, take ownership, especially the ones which have contracted the LNG coming from Arctic LNG-2, can we take over the ownership of these LNG cargoes? Yes, no, what do we do? Maybe an answer is also going to come, as usual, from China if they actually try to build these cargoes with ice-breaking capabilities. But it's going to require 2 or 3 years. So between so now and 2027, what will Arctic LNG do? So will it be operational, for example, only during summer times? Because I think this is a possibility, but it will be kind of the first time that we see an LNG export terminal operating on a seasonal basis. But I mean, maybe this is something that is going to be done. Otherwise, are the Russians also going to try to also acquire the technology and also deliver some ARC-7 LNG tankers? So that's also something to look at because the Russians are really trying to become more and more independent from Western technologies.
Well, I mean, if it's working half of a year, I mean, will it even make money at that low rate of use? Sorry, Thierry, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I think you have two problems with Arctic LNG. There is the icebreaker, and by the way, the icebreakers are used also in summer because you need to use them for the northern route. And you have also a problem, which is because US sanctions are so tough, regas terminal in Europe will not touch an Arctic LNG cargo. So it means it needs to go through the North Sea route, and it needs to have those Arctic carrier available. And I think those two elements make it even more difficult. And so I'm not so sure we are going to see this even in summer, at least 2024, 2025.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay, what else? How is the rest of well, okay, let's start with we've just come out of the winter heating season. Lots of gas in storage, in large part because of another warm winter. I think in Europe, February had the highest temperatures on record for, which is a bit worrying. What does the summer injection season look like?
Well,
Thierry?
it's going to be. Sorry, go ahead,
ahead.
Thierry. I'm talking too
No,
much
go
anyway.
ahead.
I mean, if anything, we are already at higher levels than we were last year. I just checked this morning. We are, at just below 61% at the 8th of April. So, this is unprecedented compared to any other year before. So we need much less gas to refill storage, and also our demand is relatively low. Obviously, during summer, we are not going to have that much of residential commercial demand, at least not similar to winter. But also, I don't think the industrial gas demand is going to recover that much. I mean, we just released a report on that where we analyzed, first of all, what had happened over the past 2 years, but also what were the prospects of having some industrial gas demand coming back. And first of all, the economic outlook in Europe is not looking fantastically great, to be,
Put it lightly.
Yes. Well, you look at, the numbers for Germany. I mean, if anything, they basically keep lowering their economic forecast numbers. So that's one thing to take into account, especially given, Germany's importance in terms of industrial gas demand. The second thing is that, before you had some industrial players who had actually booked or concluded contracts, several-year contracts at fixed prices, which were still enjoying, the prices that they had secured in, for example, 2021. I know some examples of that, not all of them. Some also benefited from some help from their governments, and that helped a little bit. But also, fundamentally, what has also happened is that we had seen in some sectors in the European players being undercut by imports. You can see that, for glass makers, you can see that for fertilizer, you can see that for aluminium, etc. And I don't think, Europe, with the prices that we are seeing now, is in a much better competitive position, especially vis-a-vis the US, where the prices are at $2 per MMBTU, or our friends in the Middle East, same thing. So we're not in a fantastic situation. And if anything, I think there might be a little bit of recovery of industrial gas demand, but definitely not to the levels that we had seen in 2021. So that's the first thing. And otherwise, in terms of the gas demand in the power generation, well, what we're seeing is that electricity demand is not growing so much. It's actually quite low and has been getting lower. So good for the electrification. But also we're seeing an increase in terms of renewable. Hydro levels are very good. I mean, we have probably got more rain over the past few months than, anything that I can remember. Nuclear generation in France looks healthy. I don't think we are going to decommission any more nuclear power plants in the next few years. So if anything, everything based on thermal generation, so coal and natural gas, is going to be squeezed. Well, gas may be doing better than coal, but still, that may still mean that, gas power plant may have to be running lower, unless we have extremely hot weather, which is also a possibility, another heat wave, which will then impact potentially both the nuclear generation and the hydro generation. But to be seen. I think, there is more downward signal than upward signals here.
I'm slightly less pessimistic for once than Anne-Sophie. When I look at power generation in Europe, for me, what's striking is that in Q1 2024, power generation output was slightly up 1%. And remember, last year we had reached a record low. So for me, this is a leading indicator that Europe is doing a bit better. I would agree with Anne-Sophie, it's not fantastic, but it's a bit better. And again, I will try to split Germany versus the rest of Europe. Germany is the sick man of Europe. Let's leave it, let's put it in a corner, but there will be other places where there will be growth, and interestingly, it will be in the south of Europe where the growth will happen. And so what we are seeing is with electricity prices that are quite low, and remember, because of the renewable injection, we are now having €0 per megawatt hour, sometimes during noon for quite a long period. The industries are not benefiting from this. So I think that's on the electricity side. For me, this is a leading indicator that things are getting a bit better. Again, not fantastic, and I would agree with Anne-Sophie. I mean, it's a combination of industry, it's a combination of mobility, etc., but it's an overall number. Now, I fully agree with Anne-Sophie. If I look at the split, and I've done it just before the call. Here, the split is hydro 25% up in Q1 2024 versus Q1 2023, renewable 12, and nuclear 4, which means that the ones that have been squeezed, as Anne-Sophie are saying, which is the coal and gas, minus 24% for coal, minus 10% for gas. Which again, if you're looking at, you were stating, Joe, the issue of the global warming. If you're thinking about CO2 emission, this is one way to reduce this CO2 emission. I mean, this coal and gas to renewable switch as we are entering into Europe. So I think we are seeing this, and for me, I agree with all the rest about Anne-Sophie. Gas for power generation, which is accounts, I mean, this drop in gas for power generation accounts for something like 2 to 3% of the total demand 2023. Gas for power generation drop is going to be, for me, in 2024, again, the main drop in gas demand in 2024, after we've seen the same thing in 2023. I am neutral, I would say, vis-a-vis the industry. There is a little bit more industry, but again, as Anne-Sophie stated, the $8 per million BTU is still a bit expensive for the industry in Europe. But I think we are starting to get used to it. We are starting to, the industries that have been resilient now know how to operate even with those numbers. I mean, part of them have closed down. The ones that have that are staying will be more resilient. And then we have for residential, I mean, it's finished right now. We are in summer, so let's think about how next winter will going to evolve. But I'm slightly more optimistic because there is a rebound in electricity, and for me, the rebound in electricity is always a leading indicator of GDP growth.
Okay, moving to Asia, how is demand faring there? So on the one hand, China, long since now having exited the lockdown period over a year ago, Japan restarting nuclear capacity, which is to the detriment of LNG potentially. What's going on in Asia? Thierry?
Well, I think as you said, I mean, China is growing fantastically well. I mean, we may actually in 2024 go back or even exceed the numbers that we had seen in 2021. So I think, China is back. We have seen also some interest in spot LNG over the past couple of months. So, there is opportunistic buying from the Chinese players. I mean, China is a 400 BCM market. So this is, the size of the EU before the crisis. This is a very significant market. However, I would argue that in the gas balance, LNG is the last item. So this is always a balancing item. First, you have domestic gas production. You have Russian gas, which is super cheap and is still growing. You have Central Asian gas, and then you have the LNG, and on which they have contracted a lot. So regarding China, I mean, we have definitely seen a big increase in terms of LNG imports from China. I think in 2024, we might go back to the 2021 levels, possibly exceed them, because really China is back. What you need to be mindful of, however, is the fact that LNG imports are the last item in the supply and demand balance of China. So first you have domestic gas production, then you have Russian pipeline supply, which is still increasing, by the way, and then you have Central Asian gas. And then finally, you have the LNG. What also we need to understand is that Chinese players are more and more acting like portfolio players. This is something that we have seen in 2022, and I am sure that we are going to see that again.
Mm-hmm. Thierry?
On two points to add, fully agree, 2 points to add. I mean, if I look at India, Bangladesh, Pakistan, I think, remember, those one are extremely sensitive in terms of pricing. Pricing is going down, so they may come back. But again, I would add in the merit order what Anne-Sophie didn't add, because she is a very clean person. She looked only at gas, but there is coal before. And if I look at India, unfortunately, India is also massively increased its coal production. We've seen Prime Minister, the Indian Prime Minister, stating that for the fiscal year that finished on the 1st of April, India managed to pass the 1 billion ton of coal produced, which is massive. And so I think if we want to go back to what you were alluding, Joe, which is the climate emergency, we need cheaper gas to fight this, because once this coal is up and running, it's going to be very, very difficult to fight against it, as we've seen in China in the early 2000s. So I think that's, for me, the major point that I wanted to add in terms of demand locally. What Anne-Sophie rightly stated, Chinese are becoming portfolio players. I would say, in terms of security of supply, we should be not naive in Europe that a Chinese portfolio player is not exactly that like an international portfolio player. If I may be very basic, the Shell, the Total Energy, and the BP of this world are looking at maximizing profit. The portfolio player in China may have two elements. One is maximizing profit, and second one may be a geopolitical element, stated by the Chinese Communist Party. So I think when we think in Europe that we are going to rely on Chinese LNG, it may be something that entail extra risks versus relying on the usual portfolio players or relying on the utilities we used to rely before.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, I mean, I agree with you. I mean, we have portfolio players with Chinese characteristics. However, what I wanted to say is that we have moved from, the Chinese buyers being buyers only for their domestic market to people who, if they think that we have too much LNG, will basically redirect that. So from that point of view, they have a much more international view. On India, I fully agree with you. I mean, they tend to have indeed a much more, they are extremely price sensitive. However, what we have seen over the past few months is a tremendous increase in terms of the LNG imports in India. I mean, we have seen plus 50, plus 60% over the first 2 months. So there is a lot of opportunistic buying in India, but they remain indeed extremely price sensitive. So it really depends who is buying at the end. And well, gas-fired generation is a tough nut, especially in India, but we shall see.
But again, it goes back to what I was alluding. I mean, what $8 per million BTU looks expensive back a few years ago, maybe it looks cheap today, even for India.
Okay, we've often talked about disconnect in this podcast, a disconnect between political aspirations and reality when it comes to energy planning. Thierry, a recent letter by 2 US Congress members to Dr. Bros of the IEA was criticizing the body for straying away from its core mission, which is promoting energy security. Can you offer some thoughts on that criticism?
Yes, I think what you have to understand, this is a second letter sent by the US Congress to Fatih Birol. The first letter was, I would say, a warning letter. I assume Fatih Birol did answer it. I mean, the answer hasn't been publicized, so we have to think that this second letter dated April the 3rd is a reminder to what they really want. This second letter is much tougher in requesting data and documents by the 17th of April, much tougher because it's a package. There is a second letter that has been sent to the US Energy Secretary requesting more or less the same kind of document by the same date. So the interesting element is that the US Congress will be able to look into this and to check how coherent or not coherent the elements are. So if I now go back to rewind a bit, why are the US Republican fiercely against the IEA right now as it stands? Because if you go back to the US LNG pause that was decided by President Biden, when this was explained to analysts, the Deputy Secretary, the US Deputy Secretary of Energy, used the IEA data, saying, well, because the IEA is stating that there won't be any gas demand in Europe or very little gas demand in Europe going forward, there is absolutely no need for the US to do this, which at the end of the day is a very interesting and very coherent policy. I mean, why would the US directly or indirectly finance by taxes or tax reduction the sunk assets that could be an LNG liquefaction plant if you have too much? And so the Republicans are viewing this as a national threat. They are now stating that the national threat comes from the IEA, and so they want really to try to make sure that the IEA is committed to what it's supposed to do, which is security of supply, nothing else. And they will, I think, do a few tricks. One is a very easy one. One is what has been requested in those letters. How much does it cost? What is the core business of the IEA? What is not core business? And why should the US taxpayer pay for something that is not in its own interest? And again, please keep in mind that you have more or less the same thing happening in the UK with the Prime Minister there facing criticism from the IEA for relaunching some upstream FID, allowing upstream FID in the North Sea. So again, in the UK, you have UK taxpayers paying for an agency to criticize their own government that has been democratically elected versus an agency that hasn't been democratically elected. So I think this is where we are. And I think one of the major threats of the letter is stating that they want it's not stated exactly this way, but if I translate it in plain English, they want the IEA to be removed from Paris into a location that is more coherent with energy security. And I think that's going to be a very tough call on the IEA going forward, whoever wins the US presidential election, because once policymakers have numbers in front of them and they need to cut, they will perhaps cut, and they should cut what is not relevant to them. I remind you that at the European level, we are exiting slowly but we've been exiting the energy charter because the energy charter was not up to what we wanted. And so the US may, in one way or another, try to reduce the IEA to just security of supply.
Okay,
I think this is a very interesting, evolution, but which, the US is not isolated in criticizing the IEA. I mean, we have seen, other bodies criticizing the IEA, notably OPEC, notably Abdulaziz bin Salman, who, when he discovered the first net zero report in 2021, described that as la 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 land. So, there are a certain number of people who are criticizing the IEA. In particular, they are also criticizing the net zero scenario. One thing about that, is that when the IEA published its first net zero emission scenario, and there was also a push from other people to the IEA to publish such a scenario, BP had published its first net zero scenario the year before. I know because I was part of the team which did that. So it would have been extremely awkward for the IEA not to publish such a scenario while BP, an oil and gas company, had published such a scenario a year before. So from that point of view, I think the IEA is doing its job. Now that a certain number of stakeholders are not happy with that, including OPEC, that's perfectly understandable. The US, however, is a completely different matter, and the US is also a very large oil producer. It's by far the largest gas producer in the world. It's also, significant, although very small compared to China in terms of coal. But this is also a country which does matter, especially in terms of oil and gas. And well, a part of the people there do not like the IEA messages, and very importantly, and despite some calls, including from analysts like myself, to the IEA to publish as a net zero scenario on a region by region basis, they have never done that. So when you're looking at the numbers, you are trying to guess what are the implications for the different countries and regions, and basically in terms of oil and gas, who is going to be the last man standing. And I don't know whether you remember, but in the first net zero emission scenario in 2021, there was a beautiful graphic about LNG trade and LNG trade in net zero scenario. And well, the US was not the last man standing, Qatar was, which is very interesting when you put that back in the context of the US LNG pause, but also the expansion of US LNG liquefaction capacity, and the US becoming, already being, but staying forever now, the largest LNG exporter. So there is also quite a bit of that the IEA would have to address. And last point, where the US is a very significant contributor to the IEA budget.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I think the difference between the US and Saudi Arabia is one is a member and a contributor to the
exactly.
budget. The other one is in an organization sitting on the other side of the table. And perhaps, Anne-Sophie, to make you happy, perhaps let's read one of the bullet points of the US letter. Will the IEA make all data, assumption, and methodology contained in its reports freely available to the US taxpayers? First question. Second question, if not, why not?
The US is not the country which is moderately unhappy about, some of the IEA statements. I mean, Japan has also not been completely happy because that, security of supplies, the importance of LNG, the fact that, we need to continue to invest into LNG. I mean, read the last letter of the chairman of IEA to the US, which was published in the national interest, where they are saying, no, I mean, you don't want to do the pause on US LNG. This is terrible for the world and for us in particular, because they have a totally different outlook when it comes to future LNG demand, which is actually not seeing, LNG demand dropping massively as we are seeing in some of the IEA scenarios.
And I think the question about relocation of the IEA could benefit Japan, which is the country that has the best track record in terms of security of supply. If we go back to who is really doing its job in terms of security of supply, who has more strategic oil stocks than needed, it's not Europe, it's Japan. So who is really interested in this more than Europe, because in fact Europe rediscovered security of supply just because of the war in Ukraine, but it could benefit Japan. It's a blow to Paris. Let's put it this way. It's a blow to Paris, and it's a blow to Macron, as it was mentioned in the first letter.
Well, having the free access to the data would certainly be welcome for journalists. Okay, any finishing thoughts, guys?
I think, for us, probably the next stage in about 2 months from now is going to be the European election, which are going to be particularly important to determine the future. And then next, at the end of the year, is going to be, of course, the US election. Meanwhile, I would warn, all policymakers in the world against complacency, because things happen, as we have seen. We have had a war, we have had COVID, we have had the Suez Canal disruption, we have had the Panama problem. So, don't think that everything is going to continue smoothly. Be prepared.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, and perhaps to end up with where you started, Joey, perhaps unfortunately, because we've had 5 years of dogmatic green agenda, the green agenda is now put on the back burner in many countries, and I think this is already happening in Europe. Let's be very honest, and again, we could have done a lot of stuff to try to reduce CO2 emission. I mean, as I was alluding earlier, the coal and gas to renewable switch is happening. We could have kick-started a bit earlier as the UK had done it. We could have done stuff to go faster, but because we wanted to be very dogmatic, we failed in major on major levels, and so this is now going to be way more difficult for the policymaker to push. I mean, we've talked about the hydrogen, we've talked about other elements, and I think, unfortunately, the new series of elections that are coming will see the climate not top of the agenda going forward.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, thank you to both of you. And thank you everyone for tuning in to another episode of NGW's In a Nutshell podcast, where we delve into the latest developments impacting the global market for gas. Thank you.